on the fundamental questions that economists look to. And that really is, how are people motivated to do what they do? What is that leads from desire through belief to action?
Hi everyone, my name's Nicholas Gruen. I'm an independent scholar, writer and CEO of Lateral Economics. Welcome to this podcast. I'm with my friend Peyton Bowman, who's an educator and amateur scholar living in Japan. He focuses on opportunities for non-professional learners and thinkers, and we have a special guest with us. I like using his long name, Josiah Ober, well known as Josh Ober to most people. He's a scholar of considerable note. Now here's a trick. My wife is Greek, so I better try and get this right. He's the Tsatskopoulos Konoulakis Professor in honor of Konstantin Mitsotakis. It's at Stanford University, a historian of some note of classical Greece. Mitsotakis is a former Prime Minister of Greece and the father of the current Prime Minister, which I think is a moderately bad sign for a country. a dynastic succession. We've had a few in most countries. But anyway, that's a sidelight. Now, what we're going to talk about, or the idea that we're going to introduce, is an idea that was an important one in my life. I am the son of an economist, and the concept is enlightened self-interest. Now, that is a subject which, if you look at its currency using Google's Ngram, if you look at how often it was mentioned in writing over the 20th century, it started, or rather, well, we'll go back another century, nothing much happened to it until about 1900. And then by 1920, it was quite a popular expression, and it reached its apogee in the 1970s. I want to argue that economics is an important part of that, and the fundamental idea is a simple one. And I think Arnold Schwarzenegger put it very well when he said that every extra dollar he earned really didn't earn him much satisfaction, didn't do much for him compared with what an extra dollar would be like in the hands of a poorer person. In other words, money is very important until it starts getting less important. Money is like every other good. It has diminishing marginal returns. And as we get richer, we should be thinking of trying to escape from an easy fallacy, which is that we get into this habit of acquiring things, and we think that life is only about doing more of that. And if we are enlightened, our self-interest needs to blossom out into something more sustaining than that very simple idea. So that idea has now gone into eclipse. It's sort of mentioned about half as often as it was in the late 1960s. And then I put into Ngram, which measures how often these expressions are used. I made up a term, which turns out to be a good term to have made up. The term is more is better. So that's a kind of a contrasting thought. And more is better burbles along at the bottom, goes nowhere until about the apogee, at about the height of when enlightened self-interest is figuring in our language. In the late 60s, it just takes off, and it's now used much more often than the expression enlightened self. So not the most rigorous piece of research, but I think indicative research. So I want to introduce Josiah Ober. I want him to briefly just tell us about his new book, because it gives us some concepts with which to think about these things and to think about the ways in which the ancient Greeks thought about this, and then to take us into some of those concepts. Over to you, Josh.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicholas. Very happy to have a chance to have this conversation. So the book called The Greeks and the Rational, The Discovery of Practical Reason, and it's really a book about the problem of cooperation. So the idea is that cooperation is absolutely essential for human beings because we're interdependent. We're not the kind of animals that can just live on our own. Were we orangutans, we could quite happily live each in our own tree together with one another on a very occasional basis for purposes of of mating, and that would be about it. But
you can say that, Josh. We don't have a big orangutan audience, so
that's right.
We can pick on the.
I'm not thinking it's not better or worse that orangutans do it that way. It's just that orangutans are what Aristotle called solitary animals.
Yep.
He didn't know about orangutans, but he knew about other kind of solitary animals.
Yep.
But we're the kind of being that Aristotle called political animals.
Yep.
That is, we need each other. We can't possibly flourish. We can't achieve our ends. We can't even survive unless we're in some kind of a community. So we've got to find a way then to cooperate. And the problem, this is really what I discuss in the book, the problem is that sometimes the interests of ourselves in plural is not identical to the interest of myself or my small group in the singular. And this is a really deep problem that is really at the heart of lots of social policy. I think it's a core problem of economics that the field of economics seeks to address. And I argue in the book is that this problem was well recognized by the classical Greeks, by the writers like Homer or later Herodotus, Thucydides, and especially by Plato and Aristotle, and that they developed, at least by the time of Plato and Aristotle, had developed a really sophisticated theory or set of theories, which was intended to both explain what is the problem of cooperation, what is this issue of my good is not necessarily our good, and I might be pursuing my own interests rather than our interests, and that sometimes my interests may just simply be in conflict with our interests. So they saw that as a fundamental problem. They saw it as a problem that was embedded in human nature. They didn't think you could just get out of it by being a nice person. But they also recognized that if we don't solve that problem, if we can't find a way then to recognize in your sense of enlightened self-interest that our interests must, to some extent, be my interest, that self-interest, if it is enlightened, is in fact not narrowly selfish. It recognized that the interests of others must be taken into account, or I can't have a society, I can't live in a society that in the long run, or even in the medium run, is going to actually fulfill my interest. And yet, there is this tendency towards selfishness, towards free riding, towards more is better for me, even if that means less for you. And that's really the core issue of the book: is how do you understand that as a facet of human nature? How do you go beyond it? How do you solve that problem when it arises and it becomes destructive of the whole social fabric?
Good. That's a great introduction. Peyton, do you have anything to add at this stage?
Well, yes, I think
I might just say I might just sort of sketch out the premise or the conceit of this podcast, which is that I'm someone who's fascinated with the ancient world with a view to thinking about the modern world. Josh has made his career on that, and Peyton is an amateur on that, having studied, in fact, as a student of Josh, but also quite obviously, as people will know with my discussions with Peyton, Peyton knows a hell of a lot more than I do, knows a hell of a lot about the classical world. It's clearly been something that stayed with him and that he's kept an interest. So with that having said that, Peyton, over you.
Yeah, it's worth noting I was a student of Josh's, I think, 20 years ago, and so I hope to report myself well in this conversation. I didn't pursue the path of professional classics scholarship, but I've remained interested in it ever since, and it's very important to me. And I really thought, one of the key, I guess the key sort of tool in which you're really discussing in this book is the one of practical rationality. And this is one that, I think put in a little context, and maybe around the time when I was studying in university, I was still reading a lot of the books that were kind of focused on some earlier 20th century discussions about how the Greeks were specifically not very rational in a lot of ways, particularly The Discovery of the Mind by Bruno Snell, and also I read The Greeks and the Irrational, which is an important book in sort of the history of this new book that Josh has now recently published. So I guess to sort of ask you a little bit about what is the role that rationality plays in ancient Greek thought, and how is your take a little bit different from some of the preceding discussion around how the Greeks were thinking and how they approached the question of rationality?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Peyton. And it's wonderful to be back in the classroom with you again. I'll say that, even in this virtual sort of way. So So one of the books that you mentioned by E.R. Dodds, The Greeks and the Irrational, was really the jumping off point for my own book, The Greeks and the Rational. The two books were written in the same series, the Sather Classical Lectures series. Dodds just exactly 70 years before mine. And I really set out to try to ask myself, what is there to say about rationality after Dodds? Because Dodds so eloquently demonstrated that if we just try to reduce all of Greek culture to rationality, we miss a great deal. We miss magic, we miss religion, we miss ritual, we miss performance. And so what is there left? And what I found is that there was lots of work on rationality or reason understood as scientific reason. So the whole tradition of trying to understand the world, understand the nature of the factuality of the world, understand what happened, what is, and why. But there was actually very little work by classicists, anyway, on the fundamental questions that economists like to think about, and that really is how are people motivated to do what they do? What is that leads from desire through belief to action, and especially the kind of action that we think of as economic action, action aimed at gaining the ends, and especially the material ends that the agent seeks. So although that is a pretty fundamental set of questions, how do we go about getting what we want? There really hadn't been a great deal of work on exactly that. So what I claim in the book is that we sort of missed out on that because really beginning about the time of Dodds and the work in the mid-20th century, it became really popular to believe that the Greeks were really not economic agents at all, that they didn't have any conception of the economy. They didn't think of themselves.
Which is ridiculous.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's sort of, yes, it is very strange. And it was quite popular to say that there would have been no economic growth at all across the whole of Greek history, which is pretty strange. It would appear very strange to someone like Thucydides, who starts out his history of the Peloponnesian War by talking about how basic and impoverished the Greek world was in the distant past compared to his own time, cities filled with temples and lots of people and capable of engaging in big wars and so on and so forth. At any rate, there had really been sort of a turning away of anything to do with economics, and certainly a turning away from the question of what are the micro foundations, what are the basis of human behavior in terms of economic activity. So as it turns out, if you read Plato and Aristotle with that question in mind, they were deeply interested in these questions, as was Thucydides, as was Herodotus, as ultimately Homer, that they really cared about what it is that motivated people. And for especially Plato and Aristotle, they worried that humans, in fact, most people, are actually self-interested. They thought that isn't the problem. The problem was that their interests were not the right interests. So they think fine for people to be self-interested, to seek to get what they want, if and only if what they want is what's good for them. And they thought most people actually don't know what's good for them. Now, some people, they thought, had gotten very good at getting what they want. In fact, had become quite expert at it.
At not very enlightened self-interest.
And not very enlightening, precisely.
In my terms, yeah.
Precisely so. At either getting power over others or getting wealth and just heaping up more and more wealth, but without actually asking, is that really what I should want? Is that what is good for me as a filled human being? Will that allow me to flourish? And they said, no, for the most part, people really get that profoundly wrong. So the philosophers developed what I call ethical rationality, that is an emphasis on having the right desire, wanting the right thing, pursuing those desires in the right way, and therefore coming to the correct ends, making the right choices over options and getting them to the right end. But all of that was predicated on a recognition recognition that what humans do is seek to achieve their ends. So because there's been such an emphasis on, as it were, the rationality of desire or reason's own desires, that we missed out how carefully they analyze the problem of desire itself and a desire that ends aiming at things that they thought were incorrect. So rather than just saying that people who do that are wicked, are somehow being bad people, they said that people are pursuing things because they're human. That's what we do. We identify a desire. We want something. We figure out, we rank order what we want. I want this rather than that. The world is such that I can get it if I do the following things, and so I do the following things and seek to get it. So that's actually quite a complex a set of steps, and it really requires thinking carefully about the relationship of belief to desire, to choice, to action. It really ends up doing all of the things that contemporary economists and game theorists are concerned with. So in the end, what I argued is that what we'd really missed is that Plato, Aristotle, and before them, the historians and Homer had really ultimately invented a game theoretic way of thinking about the world, about thinking about strategic rationality, instrumental rationality, and we sort of missed that they had done so much in thinking about that because they thought that in the end that was no good for you unless it was subordinated to ethical rationality, going for what really is good for you and what's good for your community.
Well, I think that is a perfect introduction to these issues, and we are trying to keep these podcasts at about 20 minutes. So we've done that perfectly. But of course, we've only just introduced a bunch of subjects, and I'm champing at the bit to ask more, which we will do in another podcast. I want to, so thank you very much for this. We will put a number of things up on our show notes, that graph that you that I spoke to earlier, Josh's book, a number of other books, some great titles there. I'll give you some examples. Democracy Before Liberalism in Theory and Practice. What an interesting subject. The Rise and Fall of Classical Greece. Well, that's been done before. Nothing very unique about that. Democracy and Knowledge. Again, what an interesting subject. Those are plenty more there. So thank you, Josh. Thank you, Peyton. And we will, I'm sure you are champing at the bit, just like me, to click on the next podcast where we will continue this discussion.
Thanks so much.